I'm Alicia Williams, 38 years old, and 8 months ago something happened in a corporate boardroom that changed everything. I watched a room full of executives dismiss my marketing campaign as too urban for our brand, their faces twisted with the kind of discomfort that comes when someone says the quiet part out loud. But what my company did next was even worse. If you've ever experienced racism in the workplace, please let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to join others who understand this struggle. Growing up in Atlanta in the 1980s, I learned early that excellence wasn't optional for girls who looked like me. My grandmother Evelyn, who had marched with Dr. King and faced down police dogs in Birmingham, would sit me down at her kitchen table every Sunday after church and remind me that I carried the dreams of generations on my shoulders. "Baby girl," she'd say, stirring her famous mac and cheese, "they gonna try to make you small, but you were born to take up space." She'd tell me stories about the women who came before us, who cleaned white folks' houses by day and organized voter registration drives by night, who saved every penny to send their children to college, who smiled through indignities so their daughters could walk through doors that had been slammed in their faces. My parents, both educators, reinforced this message daily. Daddy taught high school history, and Mama was an elementary school principal, and they made sure I understood that education was our family's religion. They enrolled me in Jack and Jill, sent me to cotillion, and made sure I could code switch between the language of home and the language of success. I learned to speak two languages fluently: the rich, expressive vernacular of my community and the crisp, measured tones of predominantly white spaces. At home, I could say, "Girl, you better stop playing with me," but in school presentations it became, "I respectfully disagree with that assessment." This wasn't about shame or hiding who I was. It was about survival and strategy. When I got accepted to Spelman College on a partial scholarship, my whole church celebrated like I'd won the lottery. Reverend Hayes announced it from the pulpit, and the congregation erupted in applause and amens. Spelman changed my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. For the first time, I was surrounded by brilliant black women who looked like me, thought like me, and dreamed as big as I did. My professors, mostly black women themselves, didn't just teach us marketing principles and business theory. They taught us how to navigate corporate America while keeping our souls intact. Dr. Amara Johnson, my favorite professor, would always say, "Ladies, you're not just getting an education, you're getting armor for the battles ahead." College wasn't without its challenges. I worked 3 jobs to help pay for school, tutoring underclassmen, working in the campus bookstore, and cleaning offices downtown on weekends. I remember one particularly difficult semester when I was so broke I was eating ramen noodles for every meal, and my roommate Tanya caught me crying over my textbooks. She didn't say a word, just went to her closet and pulled out a care package her mother had sent, filled with homemade cookies and a $50 bill. "We lift each other up," she said simply. "That's what we do." That moment taught me something about community that I carry with me to this day. After graduating summa cum laude from Spelman, I earned my MBA from Howard University, another HBCU that reinforced the importance of excellence and community. Howard's business school was intense, competitive, and filled with some of the brightest minds I'd ever encountered. My professors there, including several who had broken barriers in corporate America themselves, prepared us for the realities we'd face as Black professionals in predominantly white industries. They taught us about microaggressions before the term became mainstream, about the importance of documentation, about finding allies and building networks. Professor Williams, who had been one of the first Black executives at a Fortune 500 company, would often say, "You'll have to be twice as good to get half as much, but that doesn't mean you should accept half. It means you should be so undeniably excellent that they have no choice but to recognize your worth. My first job out of graduate school was at a small marketing firm in Atlanta, where I was one of only 3 Black employees out of 50. The learning curve was steep, not just professionally but culturally. I had to learn the unspoken rules of corporate America, how to make my voice heard in meetings without being labeled aggressive, how to build relationships with colleagues who had never worked closely with Black people before, how to navigate office politics while maintaining my integrity. My supervisor, a white woman named Carol, took me under her wing and taught me the importance of building a paper trail, of following up on verbal conversations with email summaries, of always being prepared with data to back up my ideas. Within 2 years, I had helped the firm land 3 major clients and had been promoted to account manager. I was building a reputation for innovative campaigns that connected with diverse audiences, something that was becoming increasingly valuable as companies recognized the purchasing power of multicultural consumers. I remember the first time I presented a campaign that incorporated elements of Black culture, music, imagery, language, and watched the room light up with excitement. It was then that I realized my cultural knowledge wasn't just personal, it was professional currency. By my late 20s, I had moved to a larger firm and was managing a team of 5 junior marketers. I made it a point to mentor young professionals of color, remembering how important Dr. Johnson's guidance had been to me. I would take them to lunch, review their presentations, and share the unwritten rules I had learned through trial and error. I also made sure to stay connected to my community, volunteering with the local chapter of the National Association of Black MBAs and speaking at career fairs at HBCUs. My grandmother always said, "When you climb the ladder, make sure to send it back down for the next person." Meeting Marcus at a Howard University alumni event felt like destiny. He was a high school history teacher with a passion for social justice and a laugh that could fill a room. Our first date lasted 8 hours, talking about everything from our shared love of neo-soul music to our dreams of making a difference in the world. He understood the pressures I faced as a Black woman in corporate America because he faced similar challenges in education. When we got married 3 years later, grandmother Evelyn, then in her 80s, danced at our reception with tears streaming down her face. "Look at what we built," she whispered to me during our dance. "Look at how far we've come." Our children, Jasmine and David, were born into a world of possibility that my grandmother could never have imagined. We raised them to be proud of their heritage while preparing them for the realities they might face. We filled our home with books by Black authors, art by Black artists, and music that celebrated our culture. Sunday dinners at our house were legendary, with extended family, friends, and neighbors gathering around our table to share food, stories, and laughter. Marcus would play his guitar while I cooked, and the kids would help their great-grandmother Evelyn tell stories about the civil rights movement. These moments grounded us, reminded us who we were and where we came from. By my mid-30s, I had established myself as a rising star in the marketing world. I had won several industry awards, been featured in marketing publications, and was frequently invited to speak at conferences about multicultural marketing. Companies were finally beginning to understand that diversity wasn't just about doing the right thing, it was about reaching new markets and driving revenue. I specialized in campaigns that authentically connected with urban consumers, particularly young Black and Latino audiences who had been largely ignored by mainstream marketing. When the opportunity arose to join TechFlow Solutions as their senior marketing director, I knew it was my chance to make a real impact. TechFlow was a mid-sized technology company that had grown rapidly but struggled to connect with diverse consumer segments. During my interview process, CEO Sarah Mitchell spoke passionately about the company's commitment to diversity and inclusion, and I felt excited about the possibility of bringing my expertise to a company that seemed ready to embrace change. My first year at TechFlow exceeded all expectations. I led the development of three major campaigns that increased our market share among multicultural consumers by 35%. I built a diverse team of talented marketers and established partnerships with minority-owned advertising agencies. The company's revenue grew by 22% that year, and I was recognized as Employee of the Year. I felt like I had finally found a place where my cultural knowledge and professional expertise were not just valued but celebrated. I was at the peak of my career, earning a six-figure salary, living in a beautiful home in a great neighborhood, and watching my children thrive in excellent schools. Marcus and I had built the life we had dreamed of, and I was using my platform to mentor other young professionals of color. I served on the board of the local Urban League chapter and had started a scholarship fund for HBCU students pursuing careers in marketing. Life felt full of possibility and purpose, but success in corporate America as a Black woman is always precarious, always dependent on the goodwill of people who may not understand your value or may feel threatened by your excellence. I had experienced microaggressions throughout my career, comments about my hair, assumptions about my background, being mistaken for administrative staff, but I had never faced overt discrimination. I had convinced myself that my track record of success would protect me, that my results spoke louder than any prejudices. The first signs of trouble were subtle. In meetings, I noticed that my ideas were sometimes ignored until a white colleague repeated them and received credit. I found myself being excluded from informal conversations and after-work social events. When I raised concerns about our marketing campaigns lacking diversity, I was told that we needed to focus on our core demographic. These incidents felt uncomfortable, but I rationalized them as typical corporate politics rather than something more sinister. The catalyst came during our quarterly strategy meeting in March. I had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive presentation for a new campaign I called Authentic Voices, designed to connect with young urban consumers through culturally relevant messaging, music partnerships, and community engagement. The campaign would partner with Black-owned businesses, incorporate hip-hop and R&B music, sponsor community events, and feature influencers who authentically represented urban culture. My research showed that this demographic represented a $1.3 trillion market opportunity that our competitors were already beginning to tap into. As I walked into that boardroom, laptop bag slung over my shoulder and presentation materials perfectly organized, I felt confident and prepared. I had no idea that I was about to experience the kind of overt racism that my grandmother had warned me about, the kind that would force me to choose between my dignity and my career. The room was filled with the usual suspects: 8 white executives, one Asian American colleague, and me. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. Understanding who I am requires understanding where I come from, and my identity was forged in the rich soil of Black Southern culture. My family's roots run deep in Atlanta's Auburn Avenue, the street that Dr. King called the richest Negro street in the world. My great-grandfather owned a barber shop there in the 1940s, and my great-grandmother took in laundry to help send their children to college. They understood something fundamental about survival and success. You had to be rooted in your community while reaching for something bigger. Sunday mornings in our house were sacred. The smell of bacon and grits would wake me up, followed by the sound of Mahalia Jackson or the Clark sisters playing on the stereo while Mama got ready for church. We attended Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Dr. King had preached, and I grew up understanding that faith and social justice were inseparable. Reverend Hayes, a woman who had broken barriers by becoming one of the first female pastors in our denomination, would preach sermons that connected biblical stories to contemporary struggles. Moses didn't just lead the Israelites out of Egypt, she would say, her voice rising with passion. He led them through the wilderness of systemic oppression to the promised land of justice and equality. Our family dinners were legendary affairs that could last for hours. Grandmother Evelyn would cook for days, preparing her famous fried chicken, collard greens seasoned with smoked turkey, cornbread that melted in your mouth, and sweet potato pie that could make you weep. But the food was just the backdrop for the real nourishment. The stories, the laughter, the debates, and the wisdom passed down through generations. My uncles would argue about politics while my aunts shared neighborhood gossip, and the children would listen, absorbing lessons about resilience, community, and the importance of lifting each other up. Hair was always a significant part of my identity journey. I remember the Saturday morning rituals at Miss Ruby's beauty salon, where women would gather not just to get their hair done, but to share news, offer support, and build community. Miss Ruby, who had been doing hair for 40 years, would tell stories about the civil rights movement while she pressed and curled, reminding us that our hair was beautiful in all its forms. When I decided to go natural in my 30s, it was both a personal choice and a political statement. I remember the first time I wore my natural hair to a client meeting, the way some people stared, the way I had to resist the urge to explain or apologize for my choice. Music was the soundtrack of my childhood and remains central to my adult life. We listened to everything from gospel to jazz to hip hop, understanding that Black music was more than entertainment, it was resistance, celebration, and cultural preservation, all rolled into one. When I was developing marketing campaigns, I would often think about how music could connect with audiences on an emotional level, how the right song could make people feel seen and understood. This understanding would later become central to my Authentic Voices campaign, and ironically the source of my professional downfall. Learning to navigate predominantly white spaces was like learning a second language. My parents prepared me for this reality with what we called the talk, not just about police interactions, but about how to succeed in environments where I might be the only Black person in the room. You have to be twice as good to get half as much, Daddy would say, echoing a truth that every Black parent knows. But don't let that make you bitter. Let it make you better. They taught me to document everything, to build alliances, to pick my battles carefully, and to never let anyone make me feel ashamed of who I was. At TechFlow, I had become skilled at code switching, moving seamlessly between the professional language required in boardrooms and the more relaxed, culturally rich communication style I used with my team and community. I could discuss quarterly projections with the C-suite in the morning and then switch to planning a community outreach event with local Black business owners in the afternoon. This ability to move between worlds was both a strength and a burden. It required constant vigilance and emotional labor that my white colleagues never had to expend. My mentorship of younger professionals of color was deeply personal. I saw myself in their eager faces, remembered my own struggles to find my place in corporate America. Tanya Mitchell, a 26-year-old marketing coordinator who had joined our team 6 months earlier, reminded me of myself at that age, brilliant, ambitious, and sometimes unsure of how to navigate the unspoken rules of corporate culture. I would take her to lunch regularly, reviewing her presentations and sharing strategies for building credibility and visibility. Don't shrink yourself to make others comfortable, I would tell her. Your perspective is valuable precisely because it's different. The morning of March 15th started like any other. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., spent 30 minutes in prayer and meditation, then went for a run through our neighborhood. The spring air was crisp, and I felt energized and focused. I had spent the previous evening reviewing my presentation one final time, practicing my delivery in front of Marcus, who had listened patiently and offered encouragement. "You've got this, baby," he had said, kissing my forehead. "They'd be crazy not to see the value in what you're proposing." I arrived at the office early, as was my habit, and spent an hour making final adjustments to my slides. The Authentic Voices campaign represented months of research, consumer insights, and strategic planning. I had identified a significant market opportunity that our competitors were already beginning to exploit, and I had developed a comprehensive approach to capture that market while staying true to our brand values. The campaign would feature partnerships with Black-owned businesses, music from emerging hip-hop and R&B artists, community event sponsorships, and social media campaigns that used authentic cultural language and imagery. The quarterly strategy meeting was held in the executive conference room on the 20th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. As I set up my laptop and arranged my materials, I felt the familiar pre-presentation butterflies mixed with excitement. This was my moment to show the leadership team how we could tap into a $1.3 trillion market while building authentic connections with communities that had been largely ignored by our industry. The room filled with the usual suspects: CEO Sarah Mitchell, a 45-year-old white woman who had built the company from the ground up; CFO Robert Chin, a soft-spoken Asian American man who rarely spoke unless asked direct questions; VP of Sales Jennifer Walsh, a blonde woman in her 50s who had been with the company for 8 years; and VP of Marketing Brad Thompson, a 52-year-old white man who had joined the company 2 years earlier from a larger corporation. There were also 4 other directors and senior managers, all white except for Mike Chin, Robert's younger brother, who headed our IT department. I was the third presenter of the day, following updates on our quarterly financial performance and a review of our customer satisfaction metrics. When Sarah called my name, I stood up with confidence, clicked to my first slide, and began my presentation. "Good morning, everyone. Today I want to share an exciting opportunity to expand our market reach and connect with a demographic that represents significant untapped potential for TechFlow solutions." For the first 10 minutes, everything went smoothly. I presented the market research showing the purchasing power of young urban consumers, demonstrated how our competitors were successfully targeting this demographic, and outlined the revenue potential for our company. I could see heads nodding around the table, and Sarah was taking notes, which I interpreted as a positive sign. Then I got to the creative elements of the campaign. I showed mock-ups of advertisements featuring young Black and Latino models, played samples of the hip-hop and R&B tracks we would license, and explained how we would partner with Black-owned businesses and sponsor community events in urban markets. The energy in the room shifted palpably. I could see uncomfortable glances being exchanged, and Brad Thompson's expression had changed from neutral interest to obvious disapproval. When I finished my presentation and asked for questions, the room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Brad cleared his throat and leaned forward in his chair. "Alicia, I appreciate the work you've put into this, but I have some serious concerns about the direction you're proposing." His tone was condescending, the way you might speak to a child who had suggested something naive and impractical. "I'm listening," I replied, maintaining my professional composure while feeling my heart rate increase. "Well, frankly, this campaign feels too urban for our brand," Brad said, emphasizing the word urban in a way that made its racial implications unmistakable. "Our core demographic is suburban professionals, and I'm concerned that this kind of messaging might alienate them. We need to be careful about maintaining our brand values and not going in directions that could damage our reputation with our existing customer base. The room fell silent again. I felt the familiar sensation of being the only black person in a room where my race had suddenly become the elephant that everyone was pretending not to see. Could you clarify what you mean by too urban? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. Brad shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You know, the music choices, the imagery, the language, it's just not aligned with our brand identity. We're a technology company serving business professionals, not a hip-hop record label. Several people around the table nodded in agreement, and I realized that this wasn't just Brad's opinion, it was a consensus that had been reached before I even entered the room. The research clearly shows that this demographic has significant purchasing power and is underserved by our industry. I responded, clicking back to my data slides. We're talking about a $1.3 trillion market opportunity. Our competitors are already moving in this direction and seeing substantial returns. But at what cost? Jennifer Walsh interjected. We have to think about our brand integrity and whether this kind of campaign aligns with our company values. The irony of a white woman lecturing me about brand integrity while dismissing a campaign designed to include communities that had been systematically excluded was not lost on me. Sarah Mitchell, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. Alicia, I think what Brad and Jennifer are trying to say is that we need to be strategic about how we expand our market reach. Maybe there's a way to target diverse consumers without being so explicit about it. Her use of the word explicit to describe authentic cultural representation felt like a slap in the face. I took a deep breath, drawing on decades of experience navigating these kinds of conversations. I understand the concern about brand alignment, but I would argue that authenticity is exactly what our brand needs. Young consumers, regardless of their background, can spot inauthentic marketing from a mile away. This campaign isn't about changing who we are as a company, it's about expanding our definition of who we serve. Brad shook his head dismissively. I just don't think this is the right direction for us. Maybe we should table this discussion and focus on campaigns that are more aligned with our current brand positioning. The finality in his tone made it clear that this wasn't a discussion, it was a rejection. As the meeting moved on to other topics, I sat in stunned silence, my carefully prepared presentation reduced to a few slides that had been dismissed as too urban for a company that claimed to value diversity and inclusion. The irony was crushing. I had been hired specifically for my expertise in multicultural marketing, but when I tried to apply that expertise, it was deemed incompatible with the company's values. After the meeting ended, I gathered my materials and walked back to my office in a daze. Tanya was waiting for me with a cup of coffee and an expectant smile. "How did it go?" she asked. And I could see the hope in her eyes, the same hope I had felt that morning. "It didn't go well," I said simply. Closing my office door behind me, I spent the next hour staring out my window, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't just a rejected campaign proposal, it was a rejection of my cultural knowledge, my professional expertise, and ultimately my value to the organization. That afternoon, I did something I had never done before in my professional career. I called in sick and went home early. I needed time to think, to process, and to figure out my next steps. As I drove home, I called my grandmother, who listened patiently as I recounted the morning's events. "Baby girl," she said, when I finished, her voice carrying the weight of decades of similar experiences. "This ain't about your ideas being too urban. This is about them being too threatened by your excellence to let you succeed. But you remember what I taught you. When they try to make you small, you get bigger. When they try to silence you, you get louder. And when they try to steal your dreams, you build new ones they can't touch." Her words gave me strength, but they also crystallized something I had been trying to avoid acknowledging. This wasn't going to be resolved through normal corporate channels. TechFlow had made their position clear, and no amount of data or persuasion was going to change their minds. If I wanted justice, I was going to have to fight for it myself. That evening, as I sat at my kitchen table with Marcus and the kids, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my career and my life. I was going to document everything, build a case, and hold TechFlow accountable for their discrimination. I had no idea that within 6 months, I would watch a competitor launch a nearly identical campaign and generate millions in revenue from the ideas that had been deemed too urban for my own company. The next morning, I returned to work with a new sense of purpose. I began keeping detailed records of every meeting, every conversation, and every decision that seemed influenced by racial bias. I started building relationships with colleagues who might serve as witnesses or allies, and I began researching my legal options, reaching out to civil rights attorneys and organizations that specialized in workplace discrimination. What I didn't know was that Brad Thompson's brother-in-law worked at Trend Forward Marketing, our biggest competitor, and that my presentation materials would soon find their way into their hands. I didn't know that within months, I would watch them launch a campaign called Real Connect that bore a striking resemblance to my authentic voices concept. And I didn't know that this betrayal would ultimately become the evidence I needed to expose not just individual racism, but a pattern of systemic discrimination that went far deeper than one rejected presentation. The fight for justice was just beginning, and I was about to learn that sometimes the most powerful weapon against racism isn't silence or accommodation. It's the truth, documented, witnessed, and shared with a community that refuses to let injustice stand unchallenged. 3 days after my presentation was rejected, I received an email from Jennifer Walsh requesting a meeting to discuss the feedback from the strategy session and explore alternative approaches. The message was professionally worded, but something about its tone made me uneasy. I had worked with Jennifer for over a year, and this formal language was unlike her usual direct communication style. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Conference Room B, a smaller windowless space that felt more like an interrogation room than a collaborative workspace. When I arrived, Jennifer was already seated at the oval table with a legal pad covered in notes and a manila folder that she kept closed throughout our conversation. Her body language was stiff, and she avoided making direct eye contact as I took my seat across from her. Alicia, I wanted to follow up on your presentation from Monday, she began, her voice carefully modulated. I think there may have been some miscommunication about the feedback you received, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page moving forward. I pulled out my own notebook, a habit I had developed after years of learning that documentation was essential in corporate environments. I'm listening, I said, maintaining a professional tone while feeling my guard go up. Well, I think Brad's comments may have come across more harshly than he intended. Jennifer continued, finally meeting my eyes. He wasn't rejecting your ideas entirely. He was just expressing concern about the execution and whether it aligned with our current brand strategy. You know how passionate he is about maintaining brand consistency. The word passionate struck me as an interesting choice to describe what I had witnessed in that boardroom. Brad's dismissal of my campaign hadn't felt passionate. It had felt dismissive and racially charged. Jennifer, he specifically said the campaign was too urban for our brand. I'm not sure how else to interpret that feedback. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair and glanced down at her notes. I think what he meant was that the campaign might be too niche for our broad customer base. You know, we serve clients across many different demographics, and we need to make sure our marketing appeals to everyone, not just specific segments. This was classic corporate gaslighting, and I recognized it immediately. The attempt to reframe Brad's obviously racial language as concern for broad appeal was insulting to my intelligence and experience. Jennifer, I've been doing multicultural marketing for over 15 years. I understand the difference between niche targeting and inclusive marketing. The campaign I presented was designed to expand our reach while maintaining broad appeal. Of course, Jennifer said quickly, raising her hands in a placating gesture. No one is questioning your expertise, Alicia. We all respect your background and experience. I think this is just a matter of finding the right approach for our specific company culture and client base. The phrase company culture was another red flag. In my experience, when white executives talked about protecting company culture, they were often talking about protecting whiteness. Can you help me understand what aspects of the campaign didn't align with our company culture? I asked, leaning forward slightly. Jennifer opened her manila folder and pulled out a printed copy of my presentation slides. She flipped to the page showing the proposed music partnerships and pointed to the list of hip-hop and R&B artists I had suggested. Well, for example, some of these music choices might not resonate with our existing client base. We have a lot of conservative clients who might not appreciate this type of music being associated with our brand. Conservative clients, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Are you saying that our clients are uncomfortable with black music? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. Jennifer backpedaled quickly. I'm just saying that we need to be mindful of different tastes and preferences. Maybe we could find music that's more universally appealing. The conversation continued in this vein for another 20 minutes, with Jennifer systematically dismantling every element of my campaign while insisting that the feedback wasn't racially motivated. The community partnerships were too localized. The diverse imagery was not representative of our core demographic. The authentic cultural language was potentially confusing to our existing customers. What made the gaslighting particularly insidious was Jennifer's constant reassurance that my expertise was valued and respected, even as she was systematically invalidating every aspect of my professional judgment. She would preface each criticism with phrases like, "We all know how talented you are," or "Your experience is so valuable to us," before explaining why that experience couldn't be applied to our actual marketing strategy. "I want to be clear about something," I said when Jennifer finally paused in her critique. "Are you telling me that TechFlow Solutions, a company that claims to value diversity and inclusion, believes that authentic multicultural marketing is incompatible with our brand values?" Jennifer looked genuinely uncomfortable for the first time in our conversation. "Alicia, I think you're mischaracterizing what we're saying. This isn't about diversity and inclusion. This is about marketing strategy and brand positioning. We're not saying we don't want to reach diverse audiences. We're just saying we need to do it in a way that doesn't alienate our existing customer base. And you believe that showing Black and Latino faces in our advertising, partnering with Black-owned businesses, and using music that appeals to young urban consumers would alienate our existing customers," I pressed. "I think we need to be strategic about how we approach these communities," Jennifer replied, her voice taking on a slightly defensive tone. "Maybe there are ways to be more subtle about it." The word subtle was the final straw. I had spent my entire career being told to be more subtle about my blackness, to tone down my cultural authenticity, to make white people more comfortable with my presence. The suggestion that effective multicultural marketing required subtlety revealed everything I needed to know about TechFlow's true commitment to diversity. "Jennifer, I need you to understand something," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Effective multicultural marketing isn't about being subtle, it's about being authentic. The communities I'm trying to reach can spot inauthentic marketing immediately, and they reject it. If we're not willing to authentically engage with these communities, then we shouldn't be trying to market to them at all. Jennifer closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. I hear what you're saying, Alicia, and I appreciate your perspective, but at the end of the day, we need to make decisions that are in the best interest of the company as a whole. Maybe we can revisit this campaign in the future when the market conditions are more favorable. The phrase market conditions was corporate speak for when we're more comfortable with Black people, and we both knew it. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the meeting, I realized that this conversation had been less about finding alternative approaches and more about getting me to accept the rejection of my ideas without pushing back further. I'll need some time to process this feedback and consider next steps, I said, as I stood up from the table. Of course, Jennifer replied, her relief at ending the conversation evident in her voice. Take all the time you need, and Alicia, I hope you know that we really do value your contributions to the team. This is just one campaign. There will be plenty of other opportunities for you to showcase your talents. As I walked back to my office, I felt a familiar mixture of anger and exhaustion that I had experienced throughout my career whenever I encountered this type of institutional racism. The gaslighting was almost worse than the original rejection because it required me to question my own perceptions and experiences. Was I being too sensitive? Was I misinterpreting legitimate business concerns as racial bias? But as I sat at my desk and reviewed my notes from the meeting, I knew that my instincts were correct. This wasn't about brand strategy or market positioning. This was about a company that was comfortable with diversity as long as it remained invisible and unthreatening. They wanted the benefits of my multicultural expertise without the discomfort of actually engaging with multicultural communities. That evening, I called Dr. Amara Johnson, my former professor and mentor, and recounted the day's events. She listened patiently before offering the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of navigating similar situations. Alicia, baby, what you experience today is a classic example of institutional racism, she said. They're not going to put on white hoods and burn crosses. They're going to use words like brand alignment and market strategies to justify their bias. But the result is the same. Your expertise is being devalued because it threatens their comfort with the status quo. Her words validated what I already knew, but had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. TechFlow's rejection of my campaign wasn't about business strategy. It was about racial bias disguised as professional judgment, and Jennifer's attempt to gaslight me into accepting that bias was just another form of discrimination. As I hung up the phone, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I was going to start documenting every interaction, every meeting, and every decision that seemed influenced by racial bias. If TechFlow wanted to discriminate against me, they were going to have to do it on the record. 2 weeks after my meeting with Jennifer, the retaliation began in earnest. It started subtly, as workplace retaliation often does, with small changes that could easily be explained away as coincidence or business necessity. My access to certain client files was restricted without explanation. I was excluded from planning meetings for campaigns I had been leading. My input was no longer sought on strategic decisions that directly impacted my department. The first major incident occurred during our monthly all-hands meeting. Sarah Mitchell was presenting the company's quarterly results, and she mentioned several successful campaigns that had contributed to our revenue growth. 3 of those campaigns had been my projects, but when she discussed them, she credited the marketing team rather than mentioning my name specifically. Meanwhile, Brad Thompson received individual recognition for a campaign that had performed significantly worse than mine. After the meeting, I approached Sarah in the hallway. Sarah, I noticed that the campaigns you mentioned were projects I led, but you didn't mention my name specifically. Was there a reason for that? Sarah looked genuinely surprised, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her. Oh, Alicia, I'm sorry. I was trying to emphasize team collaboration rather than individual contributions. I didn't mean to overlook your work. I understand the value of team recognition, I replied carefully. But Brad was recognized individually for his campaign. I'm just wondering about the inconsistency. Sarah's expression shifted slightly, and I could see her processing the implication of my question. Well, Brad's campaign was particularly innovative in its approach. Sometimes individual recognition is appropriate when someone goes above and beyond. The irony was staggering. My campaigns had outperformed Brad's by every metric: engagement, conversion rates, revenue generation, but his work was considered innovative, while mine was merely the result of team collaboration. This was a classic example of how Black women's contributions are systematically minimized in corporate environments. The exclusion from meetings became more pronounced over the following weeks. I would arrive at my office to find calendar invitations for meetings that had already taken place, or I would discover that strategic planning sessions had been rescheduled without my knowledge. When I raised these concerns with Jennifer, she would apologize profusely and blame administrative errors or communication breakdowns. I'm so sorry, Alicia, she said after I missed a crucial client strategy meeting. There must have been a glitch in the calendar system. We'll make sure to loop you in on the decisions that were made. But being looped in after decisions were made was not the same as being included in the decision-making process. I was being systematically marginalized, and everyone involved knew it. The message was clear: if you challenge the status quo, you will be punished. The most painful aspect of the retaliation was watching how my white colleagues were treated differently. Rebecca Foster, a white marketing manager who had joined the company around the same time as me, was given increased responsibilities and visibility. She was invited to present at industry conferences, included in high-level strategy sessions, and publicly praised for work that was comparable to mine. The contrast was impossible to ignore. During a team meeting in April, Brad announced that Rebecca would be leading a new campaign targeting millennial consumers. The campaign brief was remarkably similar to elements of my rejected Authentic Voices proposal, but stripped of its cultural authenticity and repackaged for a broader audience. Rebecca has shown real insight into reaching younger demographics, Brad explained, and we think she's the right person to lead this initiative. I raised my hand. Brad, this campaign seems to incorporate some of the consumer insights from my earlier presentation. Will I be involved in the development process? The room fell silent, and I could feel the tension building. Brad's jaw tightened slightly before he responded. Alicia, we're taking a different approach with this campaign. Rebecca will be building her own team for this project. I understand that, I persisted. But given my experience with multicultural marketing and the research I've already conducted in this area, it seems like my input could be valuable. We appreciate your expertise, Brad said, his tone becoming more clipped, but we want to give Rebecca the opportunity to develop her own vision for this campaign. The subtext was clear. Rebecca's vision was more palatable than my expertise, because it didn't challenge anyone's comfort level with authentic multicultural engagement. She could target young consumers without making anyone confront their biases about urban culture or Black and Latino communities. After the meeting, Tanya approached me with a concerned expression. Alicia, what's happening? It feels like you're being pushed out of projects you should be leading. I appreciated her directness, but I also knew that as a young Black woman early in her career, she was in a vulnerable position. I'm documenting everything, I told her quietly, and I want you to be careful about how you navigate this situation. Don't let my problems become your problems. But Tanya was braver than I had given her credit for. This isn't just your problem, she said firmly. If they can do this to you, they can do it to any of us. I'm keeping records too. Her solidarity meant more to me than she could have known. In environments where discrimination is systemic, having witnesses and allies is crucial. Tanya's willingness to document what she was observing provided external validation of my experiences and created a paper trail that would later prove invaluable. The retaliation escalated when I was suddenly subjected to increased scrutiny of my work. Every email I sent was questioned, every decision I made was second-guessed, and every project I led was micromanaged in ways that had never happened before. Brad began scheduling weekly check-in meetings with me ostensibly to provide support and guidance, but actually to create a record of performance concerns that didn't exist. I've noticed that your recent campaign proposals have been less focused than usual, he said during one of these meetings, referring to work that had received positive feedback from clients and generated strong results. Could you be more specific about what you mean by less focused? I asked, pulling out the performance metrics that contradicted his assessment. It's not about the numbers, Brad replied dismissively. It's about strategic thinking and alignment with company objectives. I'm concerned that you might be losing sight of the bigger picture. This was gaslighting at its most sophisticated. By focusing on subjective measures like strategic thinking and alignment, Brad could criticize my performance without having to provide concrete evidence. Meanwhile, my actual results, the objective measures of success, were dismissed as irrelevant. I began forwarding copies of all my work emails to my personal account and keeping detailed notes of every interaction with Brad and other executives. I also started reaching out to my network of professional contacts, including other Black women in marketing who had faced similar challenges. Their stories were depressingly familiar: excellent performance followed by sudden criticism, exclusion from key meetings, and systematic marginalization. Dr. Johnson connected me with attorney Malik Richardson, a civil rights lawyer who specialized in workplace discrimination cases. During our initial consultation, he reviewed my documentation and confirmed what I already suspected. What you're describing is a textbook case of retaliation, he said. They can't fire you for challenging their discriminatory practices, so they're trying to create a hostile work environment that will force you to quit. The key is to keep documenting everything and avoid giving them any legitimate grounds for termination. His advice was both validating and terrifying. Validating because it confirmed that my experiences were real and legally actionable. Terrifying because it meant that the situation was likely to get worse before it got better. As I drove home that evening, I called Marcus to update him on the day's events. His anger on my behalf was palpable, but so was his concern for my well-being. "Baby, this is taking a toll on you," he said gently. "I can see it in your face when you come home. Maybe it's time to start looking for other opportunities." "I'm not running away from this," I replied, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "If I leave now, they win. And the next Black woman who comes along will face the same treatment. Someone has to stand up to this." Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. "Then we'll stand up to it together. But promise me you'll take care of yourself in the process. This fight isn't worth your health or your sanity." His support gave me strength, but I knew that the hardest battles were still ahead. TechFlow had made it clear that they were willing to retaliate against me for challenging their discriminatory practices. What they didn't know was that I was building a case that would expose not just individual bias, but a pattern of systemic discrimination that went far beyond my own experiences. The retaliation was about to escalate even further, and I was preparing for war. By May, TechFlow's retaliation had evolved from subtle exclusion to overt hostility. The breaking point came when I discovered that Brad Thompson had been sharing my confidential performance reviews with other department heads, painting a picture of me as a difficult employee who was resistant to feedback and not aligned with company culture. This information came to me through Mike Chen, Robert's brother, who had overheard a conversation between Brad and the VP of operations. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," Mike said, approaching my desk with obvious discomfort, "but I thought you should know what's being said about you in leadership meetings." Mike had always been a quiet ally, someone who nodded supportively during my presentations and occasionally offered encouragement after difficult meetings. As one of the few other people of color in leadership positions, he understood the dynamics at play, even if he rarely spoke about them openly. "What exactly did you hear?" I asked, pulling out my notebook to document his account. "Brad was telling Jim Morrison that you've been having performance issues and that you're not responding well to constructive criticism. He said you've become defensive and argumentative in meetings and that it's creating tension within the marketing team." The characterization was both predictable and infuriating. Black women who advocate for themselves are routinely labeled as difficult or aggressive, while white men who display the same behaviors are seen as passionate or strong leaders. Brad was using racist stereotypes to justify his discriminatory treatment of me. "Did anyone push back on his characterization?" I asked. Mike shook his head. Jim just nodded and said something about how important it is to maintain team cohesion. Sarah was there too, and she didn't say anything to contradict him. This revelation was particularly devastating because it meant that the CEO was either complicit in the discrimination or willfully ignorant of it. Either way, it indicated that the problem went far beyond Brad's individual bias and reflected systemic issues within the company's leadership. That afternoon, I requested a meeting with Sarah Mitchell to address the situation directly. I had hoped that by presenting the facts clearly and professionally, I could help her understand what was happening and work toward a resolution. I was about to learn how naive that hope had been. The meeting took place in Sarah's corner office, with its impressive view of the city skyline and walls lined with awards and recognition from industry organizations. Sarah sat behind her massive desk, while I took a seat in one of the leather chairs facing her, my documentation folder carefully organized in my lap. "Sarah, I wanted to discuss some concerns I have about my treatment within the marketing department," I began, maintaining a calm and professional tone despite the anxiety building in my chest. "Of course, Alicia, I'm always open to hearing from our team members," Sarah replied, but her body language suggested otherwise. She was leaning back in her chair with her arms crossed, creating physical distance between us. I outlined the pattern of retaliation I had experienced: the exclusion from meetings, the increased scrutiny of my work, the redistribution of my responsibilities to other team members, and the negative characterizations of my performance that contradicted my actual results. I presented specific examples with dates and witnesses, building a clear case that this treatment was connected to my challenge of the company's discriminatory practices. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes on a legal pad. When I finished my presentation, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Alicia, I appreciate you bringing these concerns to my attention," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "But I have to say, some of what you're describing sounds like normal business operations and performance management. Brad has expressed some concerns about your recent work, and it's his responsibility as your supervisor to address those concerns." "What specific concerns has he expressed?" I asked, knowing that my performance metrics contradicted any legitimate criticism. Sarah consulted her notes. "He's mentioned that you've seemed resistant to feedback and that your recent campaign proposals haven't been as strong as your earlier work. He's also concerned about your attitude in team meetings and your ability to collaborate effectively with colleagues." These were classic examples of subjective performance criticisms that could be used to justify discriminatory treatment. Sarah, my campaign performance metrics are among the highest in the department. I can provide you with specific data showing the success of my recent projects. It's not just about metrics, Sarah replied, echoing Brad's earlier dismissal of objective measures. Leadership requires emotional intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to work within our company culture. Those are harder to quantify but equally important. The phrase company culture was becoming a weapon used against me, a way to justify discrimination by claiming that my authentic self was incompatible with the organization's values. Can you help me understand what aspects of my behavior are inconsistent with company culture? I asked. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Well, for example, your reaction to the feedback on your Authentic Voices campaign was quite defensive. Instead of taking the input constructively and working to address the concerns, you seemed to take it personally and push back against the leadership team's assessment. I asked clarifying questions about feedback that seemed racially motivated. I corrected. When Brad said my campaign was too urban, I asked him to explain what he meant. Is asking for clarification considered defensive behavior? I think you may be misinterpreting Brad's feedback, Sarah said, her voice taking on a slightly patronizing tone. He wasn't making any racial judgments. He was expressing legitimate concerns about brand alignment and market positioning. Your assumption that his feedback was racially motivated suggests that you may be bringing personal biases into professional discussions. This was gaslighting at its most sophisticated and harmful. Sarah was not only denying the obvious racial implications of Brad's language, but also suggesting that my recognition of racism was itself a form of bias. She was turning my awareness of discrimination into evidence of my own professional shortcomings. Sarah, I've been doing multicultural marketing for over 15 years. I said, struggling to maintain my composure. I understand the difference between legitimate business concerns and racially coded language. When someone describes authentic multicultural marketing as too urban, that's not about brand alignment, that's about racial bias. I think we may have to agree to disagree on that interpretation, Sarah replied firmly. What I'm more concerned about is how we move forward constructively. Brad has some specific recommendations for improving your performance and your working relationships within the team. She handed me a document titled Performance Improvement Plan that outlined a series of requirements and benchmarks that I would need to meet over the next 90 days. The plan included mandatory coaching sessions with an external consultant, weekly check-ins with Brad, and specific metrics for collaboration and cultural alignment that were entirely subjective. As I read through the document, I realized that this was the company's attempt to create a paper trail that would justify my eventual termination. The performance improvement plan was a common tactic used by companies to document performance issues that could later be used to fire employees who had filed discrimination complaints. Sarah, this PIP appears to be retaliation for my raising concerns about discriminatory treatment, I said, looking up from the document. The timing and the subjective nature of these requirements suggest that this is not about genuine performance improvement. Alicia, I understand that receiving this kind of feedback can be difficult, Sarah said, her tone becoming more condescending. But sometimes we all need to take a step back and honestly assess our own contributions to workplace challenges. This PIP is designed to help you succeed, not to punish you. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with Sarah systematically dismissing each of my concerns while positioning the company's discriminatory actions as legitimate business decisions. She refused to acknowledge any possibility that racial bias might be influencing the treatment I was receiving. instead suggesting that my perception of discrimination was evidence of my own professional limitations. As I left Sarah's office with the performance improvement plan in hand, I felt a mixture of anger, disappointment, and determination. The company had made their position clear. They were going to protect Brad's discriminatory behavior and punish me for challenging it, but they had also provided me with exactly the kind of documentation I needed to build a legal case. That evening, I called Attorney Richardson to update him on the day's developments. His response was immediate and clear. "They just handed you a smoking gun," he said after I described the PIP and Sarah's dismissive response to my concerns. "This is textbook retaliation, and the timing makes their motivation obvious. We need to start preparing for the possibility that they're going to try to terminate you." "What should I do about the PIP?" I asked. "Comply with it completely," he advised. "Document every interaction, exceed every requirement, and don't give them any legitimate grounds for criticism. Meanwhile, we'll start building a comprehensive case that shows the pattern of discrimination and retaliation." As I hung up the phone, I realized that TechFlow had just escalated our conflict to a new level. They were no longer content with marginalizing me. They were actively trying to destroy my career. But in their arrogance and overconfidence, they had also provided me with the evidence I needed to hold them accountable. The war was about to begin in earnest, and I was ready to fight. The final straw came in June, just as I was beginning to see some progress with the performance improvement plan requirements. I had been exceeding every metric, documenting every interaction, and maintaining the kind of professional demeanor that would make it impossible for TechFlow to justify terminating me. But what I didn't anticipate was how far they would go to humiliate me publicly and destroy my professional reputation. The incident occurred during our annual company retreat, a 2-day event held at a luxury resort outside the city. These retreats were typically opportunities for team building, strategic planning, and celebrating company achievements. I had attended 3 previous retreats and had always found them professionally rewarding and personally enjoyable. This year would be different. The retreat began normally enough, with welcome presentations, breakout sessions, and networking opportunities. I participated fully in all activities, maintaining the positive attitude and collaborative spirit that the PEP required. During the first day's sessions, I even received compliments from colleagues on my contributions to strategic planning discussions. The disaster occurred during the second day's innovation showcase, where department heads were invited to present their team's most creative and successful campaigns from the past year. I had prepared a presentation highlighting 3 campaigns that had exceeded performance targets and generated significant revenue for the company. These were objective successes that couldn't be disputed or minimized. When my turn came to present, I walked to the front of the room with confidence, clicked to my first slide, and began discussing the first campaign's strategy and results. About 5 minutes into my presentation, Brad Thompson interrupted me from his seat in the front row. "Alicia, I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "but I think there's been some confusion about the attribution for these campaigns." The room fell silent. I felt my heart rate spike, but I maintained my composure. "I'm not sure what you mean, Brad. These are campaigns that I led and developed." "Well, that's not entirely accurate," Brad continued, standing up and walking toward the front of the room. "While you certainly contributed to these projects, they were really team efforts with significant input from other department members. I think it's important that we give credit where credit is due. This was a public humiliation designed to undermine my credibility in front of the entire company." Brad was essentially accusing me of taking credit for other people's work, which was both false and professionally devastating. I could see the confusion and discomfort on my colleagues' faces as they tried to process what was happening. Brad, I have documentation showing my leadership role in all of these campaigns. I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I'd be happy to share that information with anyone who has questions. Documentation can be misleading, Brad replied dismissively. What matters is the reality of how these campaigns were actually developed. Rebecca Foster, for example, played a crucial role in the strategy for the Millennial Campaign, and Mike Chen provided essential technical insights for the digital components. He was rewriting history in real time, diminishing my contributions while elevating the roles of white colleagues who had provided minimal input. The audience was witnessing a character assassination disguised as a clarification of facts. Sarah Mitchell, who was moderating the session, should have intervened to stop this inappropriate public confrontation. Instead, she remained silent, allowing Brad to continue his attack on my professional reputation. I think what Brad is trying to say, Sarah finally interjected, is that we want to make sure we're recognizing the collaborative nature of our work here at TechFlow. Individual recognition is important, but so is acknowledging the team efforts that make our success possible. Her intervention was worse than Brad's attack because it legitimized his false narrative while appearing to be diplomatic. She was providing institutional cover for his discriminatory behavior while publicly undermining my credibility. I made a decision in that moment that would change everything. Instead of accepting this humiliation quietly, I was going to respond with the truth, regardless of the consequences. I appreciate the importance of recognizing team contributions, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. But I also think it's important to be accurate about individual leadership roles. I have emails, project timelines, and client feedback that document my role in developing these campaigns. If there's confusion about attribution, I'm happy to provide that documentation to anyone who's interested. The room was completely silent now. My colleagues were witnessing a direct confrontation between a black woman and her white supervisor, and everyone understood the stakes involved. This wasn't just about campaign attribution, this was about power, respect, and the right to claim credit for my own work. Brad's face flushed with anger. Alicia, I think your defensive attitude is exactly what we've been discussing in your performance reviews. This kind of response to feedback is concerning and unprofessional. Asking for accuracy in attribution isn't defensive, I replied calmly. It's professional, and I'm not sure why providing documentation to support my claims would be considered unprofessional. Sarah stood up abruptly. I think we should move on to the next presentation, she said, her voice tight with tension. We can discuss attribution questions offline, but the damage was done. In front of the entire company, I had been publicly accused of taking credit for other people's work, and when I defended myself with facts and documentation, I was labeled as defensive and unprofessional. The message to everyone in that room was clear. Challenging the white male leadership would result in public humiliation and professional consequences. As I returned to my seat, I could feel the eyes of my colleagues on me. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared uncomfortable, and a few seemed to be buying into Brad's narrative. Tanya caught my eye from across the room and gave me a subtle nod of support, but I felt profoundly isolated and exposed. The rest of the retreat was torture. During breaks, some colleagues avoided me entirely, while others approached with awkward expressions of support that felt more like condolences. The public confrontation had achieved its intended effect. I was now marked as a problem employee who couldn't handle feedback and was difficult to work with. That evening, I called Marcus from my hotel room and broke down completely. The stress of months of discrimination and retaliation, culminating in this public humiliation, had finally overwhelmed my ability to maintain professional composure. They destroyed me in front of everyone, I sobbed into the phone. They made me look like a liar and a credit stealer, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Marcus listened patiently as I recounted the day's events, his anger building with each detail. Baby, what they did was wrong, and everyone in that room knows it. You don't have to accept this treatment. I can't keep fighting this alone, I said. It's destroying me. Then don't fight it alone, Marcus replied firmly. It's time to bring in the community. It's time to make this public. His words crystallized something I had been avoiding. This fight was bigger than just my individual experience. TechFlow's treatment of me was part of a pattern of systemic discrimination that affected countless other Black women in corporate America. If I was going to seek justice, I needed to do it not just for myself, but for all the women who would come after me. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. First, I called Attorney Richardson and told him I was ready to file a formal complaint. Second, I called Dr. Johnson and asked her to help me mobilize our professional network. Third, I called Reverend Hayes and asked her to help me organize community support. The final straw had been pulled, and TechFlow was about to learn that humiliating a Black woman in public comes with consequences they never anticipated. 3 months after the company retreat humiliation, I found myself sitting in a federal courthouse conference room, surrounded by the most powerful legal and community support network I had ever assembled. Attorney Malik Richardson sat to my right, his briefcase filled with months of meticulously documented evidence. Dr. Amara Johnson sat behind me, representing the National Association of Black MBAs, which had officially endorsed my case. Reverend Hayes was there with representatives from 3 other churches, and Tanya Mitchell had taken a personal day to serve as a witness. The room buzzed with quiet energy as we prepared for the mediation session that would determine whether TechFlow Solutions would face a public trial for workplace discrimination. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had reviewed my complaint and found probable cause for discrimination, giving us significant leverage in these negotiations. But I knew that TechFlow would not go down without a fight. Remember, Alicia, Attorney Richardson said, reviewing his notes one final time, they're going to try to paint you as a disgruntled employee who couldn't handle feedback. We have the documentation to counter every one of their arguments, but stay calm and let the evidence speak for itself. I nodded, feeling more prepared and supported than I had in months. The community mobilization that had begun with those 3 phone calls had grown into a movement that extended far beyond my individual case. The local chapter of the NAACP had issued a statement supporting my complaint. The Urban League had organized a letter-writing campaign to TechFlow's board of directors. And most importantly, 3 other current and former TechFlow employees had come forward with their own stories of discrimination and retaliation. The door opened, and TechFlow's legal team entered the room like an army preparing for battle. Sarah Mitchell looked uncomfortable and avoided making eye contact with me. Brad Thompson appeared defiant, his jaw set in the same expression of dismissive arrogance I had seen so many times in company meetings. They were accompanied by 2 corporate attorneys and a crisis management consultant who had clearly been brought in to minimize damage to the company's reputation. The federal mediator, Judge Patricia Williams, a distinguished Black woman in her 60s, called the session to order. We're here today to discuss the discrimination complaint filed by Ms. Alicia Williams against TechFlow Solutions. Both parties have agreed to participate in this mediation in good faith, with the goal of reaching a resolution that addresses the concerns raised in the complaint. TechFlow's lead attorney, a white man in his 50s named David Sterling, immediately went on the offensive. Your Honor, my client believes that this complaint is without merit and represents a fundamental misunderstanding of normal business operations and performance management. Williams was a valued employee who unfortunately struggled to adapt to feedback and collaborative work environments. That's an interesting characterization. Attorney Richardson responded smoothly. Given that Miss Williams consistently exceeded performance targets and received positive client feedback throughout her tenure, perhaps Mr. Sterling could explain how an employee who generated over $2 million in revenue for the company could be considered to have performance issues. Sterling shifted uncomfortably. Performance isn't just about revenue generation, it's about teamwork, cultural fit, and the ability to respond constructively to feedback. Miss Williams demonstrated concerning patterns of defensiveness and resistance to guidance from her supervisors. By defensiveness, do you mean asking for clarification when her marketing campaign was dismissed as too urban? Attorney Richardson asked, his voice sharp with precision. Or do you mean documenting meetings where she was excluded from strategic planning sessions for projects she had been leading? Judge Williams intervened before Sterling could respond. Let's focus on the specific allegations in the complaint. Mr. Sterling, how does your client respond to the allegation that Miss Williams' campaign proposal was rejected using racially coded language? Sterling consulted his notes.
Your Honor, Mr.
Thompson's feedback was based on legitimate business concerns about brand alignment and market positioning. The use of the word urban was not intended to have any racial connotations. It was simply a description of the campaign's target demographic. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Attorney Richardson opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder containing the evidence that would destroy TechFlow's defense. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit A, he said, handing copies of a document to everyone in the room. This is an email from Brad Thompson to his brother-in-law, James Thompson, who works at Trend Forward Marketing, TechFlow's primary competitor. The email is dated 3 days after Miss Williams' presentation was rejected. I watched the color drain from Brad's face as he realized what was happening. The email, which we had obtained through discovery, contained not only my complete presentation materials, but also Brad's commentary about why the campaign had been rejected. Attorney Richardson began reading from the email. Hey Jim, thought you might find this interesting. One of our marketing directors proposed this campaign targeting urban consumers, but we shut it down. Too risky for our brand image. You know how our clients feel about that kind of thing. Might be something your team could adapt for your client base though. They're more comfortable with that demographic. The room fell silent. The email was smoking gun evidence that Brad had not only rejected my campaign for racially discriminatory reasons, but had also shared my confidential work with a competitor. Judge Williams looked up from her copy with an expression of barely contained anger. Mr. Sterling, how does your client explain this email? She asked. Sterling was frantically whispering with his colleagues, clearly unprepared for this revelation. Your Honor, this email was taken out of context. Mr. Thompson was simply sharing general market insights with a family member. General market insights. Attorney Richardson responded incredulously. He shared Miss Williams' complete presentation, including proprietary research and creative concepts, with a competitor, and he explicitly stated that the campaign was rejected because of concerns about how clients would react to that kind of thing, a clear reference to the racial demographics of the target audience. But we weren't finished. Attorney Richardson pulled out another folder. Your Honor, I'd also like to present Exhibit B. This is the marketing campaign launched by Trend Forward Marketing 6 months after Miss Williams' presentation was rejected. As you can see, it bears a striking resemblance to her original Authentic Voices concept. The evidence was overwhelming. Trend Forward's Real Connect campaign used nearly identical strategies, messaging, and even some of the same music partnerships that I had proposed. The campaign had generated $15 million in revenue and won 3 industry awards. My ideas hadn't been too urban for the market. They had been too threatening for TechFlow's comfort with authentic multicultural engagement. Sarah Mitchell finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. We had no knowledge of Mr. Thompson sharing confidential information with outside parties. Perhaps not, Judge Williams replied. But you did have knowledge of the discriminatory language used to reject Miss Williams' proposal, and you failed to address it. In fact, according to the complaint, you participated in the subsequent retaliation against Miss Williams when she raised concerns about the discriminatory treatment. The next hour was a systematic dismantling of TechFlow's defense. We presented evidence of the exclusion from meetings, the performance improvement plan that was clearly retaliatory, and the public humiliation at the company retreat. We also presented testimony from Tanya and Mike Chen about the hostile work environment that had been created after I challenged the discriminatory practices. Most damaging of all, we presented evidence that I was not the only employee who had faced discrimination at TechFlow. Two other Black employees had come forward with similar stories of having their ideas dismissed, being excluded from opportunities, and facing retaliation when they raised concerns. The pattern was undeniable. Sterling made one final attempt to salvage his client's position. Your Honor, even if there were isolated incidents of poor judgment, this doesn't constitute a pattern of systemic discrimination. TechFlow has diversity and inclusion policies in place and has made significant investments in creating an inclusive workplace. Policies on paper are meaningless if they're not enforced in practice, Judge Williams responded sharply. The evidence presented today suggests a pattern of discriminatory behavior that was not only tolerated but actively protected by company leadership. She turned to address both legal teams. Based on the evidence presented, I believe Ms. Williams has a strong case for both individual discrimination and systemic workplace bias. I strongly encourage TechFlow to consider a settlement that addresses not only Ms. Williams' individual claims, but also implements meaningful changes to prevent future discrimination. The mediation broke for lunch, and when we reconvened, TechFlow's attitude had changed dramatically. Sterling approached Attorney Richardson with a settlement offer that exceeded our initial demands: full back pay for lost wages, compensation for emotional distress, a public apology from the company, and most importantly, a commitment to implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion reforms. But the real victory came when Judge Williams announced that she would be referring the case to the Department of Justice for investigation of potential civil rights violations. TechFlow's discrimination wasn't just a private employment matter, it was a federal civil rights issue that could result in criminal charges and massive financial penalties. As we left the courthouse that afternoon, I felt a sense of vindication that went beyond personal satisfaction. We had not only held TechFlow accountable for their discriminatory practices, but had also created a precedent that would protect other employees who faced similar treatment. The community that had rallied around my case had demonstrated the power of collective action in the fight for justice. Brad Thompson was terminated the following week. Sarah Mitchell resigned 2 months later, and TechFlow Solutions was forced to implement a comprehensive diversity and inclusion program that would be monitored by federal authorities for the next 5 years. Justice had been served, but more importantly, the system had been changed. The next Black woman who walked into TechFlow's offices would face a very different environment than the one that had tried to destroy me. The weeks following the settlement were a whirlwind of emotions that I hadn't fully anticipated. Victory in a discrimination case doesn't feel like the triumphant moment you see in movies. It feels like emerging from a long, dark tunnel, blinking in the sunlight and trying to remember what normal life feels like. The financial settlement provided security and validation, but the emotional toll of fighting systemic racism for over a year had left me exhausted in ways I was only beginning to understand. Marcus found me crying in our kitchen one morning, 3 weeks after the mediation, and I couldn't explain why. I won. I kept saying through my tears, I won. So why do I feel so broken? He held me while I sobbed, understanding that victory against injustice often comes with a grief that's hard to articulate. Grief for the person you were before you had to fight, grief for the innocence lost, grief for all the other battles that still need to be fought. The community response was overwhelming and healing. Reverend Hayes organized a celebration service at our church where hundreds of people gathered to acknowledge not just my individual victory, but what it represented for our collective struggle. Sister Alicia didn't just fight for herself, she preached that Sunday. She fought for every Black woman who's been told her ideas weren't good enough, every Black professional who's been excluded from opportunities, every Black person who's been made to feel like their authentic self was too much for white comfort. Johnson invited me to speak at Howard University's Business School, where I addressed a packed auditorium of young Black professionals who were preparing to enter corporate America. Looking out at their eager, hopeful faces, I felt the weight of responsibility that comes with victory. These students needed to hear that justice was possible, but they also needed to understand the cost of fighting for it. The system didn't change because it wanted to, I told them. It changed because we forced it to change. And that force came not from anger or bitterness, but from documentation, community support, and an unwavering commitment to our own worth and dignity. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond TechFlow Solutions. Within 6 months, 3 other companies in our city had reached out to Attorney Richardson, seeking guidance on how to avoid similar discrimination lawsuits. The local business community had received a clear message: discriminatory practices would have consequences, and those consequences would be public, expensive, and lasting. TechFlow's court-mandated diversity and inclusion program became a model for other organizations. The company was required to hire a chief diversity officer, implement bias training for all employees, establish clear reporting mechanisms for discrimination complaints, and submit quarterly reports to federal monitors. More importantly, they were required to actively recruit and promote employees of color, with specific targets and timelines that would be enforced by the court. Tanya Mitchell was promoted to senior marketing manager within 4 months of the settlement, and she used her new position to mentor other young professionals of color. You showed us that we don't have to accept discrimination as the price of success, she told me during one of our regular lunch meetings. You showed us that we have power, and we have rights, and we have a community that will support us when we stand up for ourselves. The ripple effects extended to other industries as well. The National Association of Black MBAs used my case as a catalyst for launching a nationwide initiative to address workplace discrimination in corporate America. They created a legal defense fund, established mentorship programs, and began tracking discrimination complaints across industries to identify patterns and systemic issues. My personal growth during this period was profound and sometimes painful. Fighting discrimination had required me to develop skills and strength I didn't know I possessed, but it had also forced me to confront aspects of systemic racism that I had previously been able to avoid or minimize. I had to learn how to process trauma while maintaining hope, how to celebrate victory while acknowledging ongoing injustice, how to use my platform responsibly while taking care of my own mental health. Therapy became an essential part of my healing process. Dr. Sandra Washington, a Black psychologist who specialized in racial trauma, helped me understand that my experience was part of a larger pattern of historical and contemporary oppression. What you experienced wasn't just individual discrimination, she explained during one of our sessions. It was the manifestation of centuries of systemic racism that's designed to make Black people question their own worth and capabilities. Working with Dr. Washington helped me understand that my anger was justified, my pain was valid, and my victory was significant not just for me, but for the broader struggle for racial justice. She also helped me develop strategies for managing the ongoing stress of being a public figure in the fight against discrimination. 6 months after the settlement, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I left corporate America entirely and started my own marketing firm. Williams and Associates specialized in helping companies develop authentic multicultural marketing strategies, and our client base grew rapidly as organizations sought to avoid the kind of discrimination lawsuit that had devastated TechFlow. I realized that I didn't want to spend the rest of my career trying to change systems from the inside. I explained to Marcus as we discussed the business plan. I wanted to build something new, something that valued authenticity and cultural competence from the ground up. The firm's success exceeded my wildest expectations. Within 2 years, we had 15 employees, offices in 3 cities, and a client roster that included Fortune 500 companies seeking genuine diversity and inclusion guidance. More importantly, we had created a workplace where young professionals of color could thrive without having to hide their authentic selves or navigate discriminatory practices. But success brought new responsibilities and challenges. As my profile grew, I became a target for criticism from people who believed I was playing the race card or being divisive. I received hate mail, negative online reviews, and even some threats that required police involvement. The price of speaking truth about racism is often becoming a target for those who benefit from maintaining the status quo. The ongoing vigilance required to maintain the changes we had fought for was exhausting but necessary. TechFlow's federal monitors discovered several attempts by the company to circumvent their diversity requirements, including hiring practices that appeared inclusive on paper but maintained discriminatory outcomes in practice. Each violation required legal intervention and community pressure to address. I also learned that individual victories, while important, don't automatically translate into systemic change. Other companies in our industry continued to engage in discriminatory practices, confident that they could avoid the kind of public scrutiny that had damaged TechFlow. The fight for workplace equity required constant attention and ongoing activism. 2 years after the settlement, I was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on workplace discrimination. Sitting in that hearing room, surrounded by lawmakers and advocates, I reflected on how far we had come and how far we still had to go. It ends when we create systems that make discrimination impossible, when we build communities that support those who speak truth to power, and when we raise a generation that refuses to accept injustice as normal. The work continues every day. Through my firm, I help companies understand that diversity and inclusion aren't just moral imperatives, they're business necessities in an increasingly diverse marketplace. Through my speaking engagements, I share strategies for recognizing and addressing discrimination. Through my mentorship, I help young professionals develop the skills and confidence they need to succeed in challenging environments. Most importantly, I've learned that justice isn't a destination, it's a journey that requires constant commitment, community support, and the courage to keep fighting even when the battles seem endless. The victory against TechFlow was significant, but it was just one battle in a much larger war for equality and justice. Every day, I wake up knowing that somewhere, a Black woman is sitting in a boardroom being told that her ideas are too urban, that her perspective isn't valuable, that her authentic self isn't welcome. And every day, I work to ensure that she has the tools, the support, and the legal protections she needs to fight back and win. The system changed because we forced it to change. And we'll keep forcing it to change, one case at a time, one company at a time, one victory at a time, Until equality isn't something we have to fight for, it's something we can simply expect. To my Black sisters and brothers watching this, I want you to understand that what happened to me wasn't unique, and what I did to fight back isn't impossible. Every day, Black professionals across this country face the same kind of discrimination I experienced at TechFlow. Your ideas are dismissed as not aligned with company culture. Your expertise is questioned while less qualified white colleagues are promoted. Your authentic self is deemed unprofessional or too much for corporate environments. But here's what I learned through this fight. Documentation is your superpower. From the moment you sense that discrimination is occurring, start keeping records. Save every email, document every meeting, record every conversation that feels racially charged. I cannot stress this enough. Your memory of events won't be enough in a legal proceeding. You need concrete evidence that can't be disputed or reinterpreted. Create a paper trail for everything. When someone makes a discriminatory comment in a meeting, follow up with an email summarizing the conversation. When you're excluded from opportunities, document the pattern with dates and witnesses. When your performance is suddenly criticized after you've challenged discriminatory practices, gather evidence of your actual results and achievements. The legal system requires proof, and that proof comes from meticulous documentation. Build your network before you need it. The community support that sustained me through this fight didn't appear overnight. It was built through years of authentic relationships with mentors, colleagues, and community leaders. Connect with other Black professionals in your industry. Join professional organizations like the National Association of Black MBAs or the National Black Chamber of Commerce. Attend networking events at HBCUs and maintain those relationships throughout your career. When you face discrimination, you'll need allies who understand your experience and can provide both emotional support and strategic guidance. The second lesson I want to share is about the power of strategic resistance. When you encounter racism in the workplace, your first instinct might be anger, and that anger is justified and valid. But channel that anger into strategic action. Don't react emotionally in the moment. Document the incident, consult with trusted advisors, and plan your response carefully. The most effective resistance to discrimination is methodical, well documented, and supported by community. Know your rights and know your resources. Familiarize yourself with your company's discrimination policies, but don't rely on them exclusively. Research the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's complaint process. Identify civil rights attorneys in your area who specialize in workplace discrimination. Connect with organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund or the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Having this information before you need it can make the difference between effective action and missed opportunities for justice. For those of you who are experiencing discrimination right now, I want you to know that you're not alone and you're not powerless. Your experience is valid, your anger is justified, and your fight for justice is necessary. Don't let anyone gaslight you into believing that obvious discrimination is just business as usual or normal workplace dynamics. Trust your instincts, document everything, and seek support from people who understand what you're going through. Remember that fighting discrimination is not just about individual justice, it's about creating change for the next generation. Every time we challenge racist practices, we make it a little bit easier for the Black professionals who come after us. Every lawsuit filed, every complaint documented, every discriminatory practice exposed contributes to a larger movement for workplace equity. I also want to acknowledge the unique challenges faced by Black women in corporate America. We experience both racial and gender discrimination, often simultaneously. We're stereotyped as angry when we advocate for ourselves, unprofessional when we express our authentic selves, and not leadership material when we demonstrate the same confidence that's celebrated in white men. These intersectional challenges require intersectional solutions, and that means building coalitions with other women of color and allies who understand the complexity of our experiences. Our cultural strength is not a liability. It's an asset that corporate America needs, even when they don't recognize it. The same cultural knowledge that was dismissed as too urban at TechFlow is now generating millions of dollars for companies that are smart enough to embrace authentic multicultural marketing. Your perspective, your creativity, your understanding of diverse communities, these are valuable professional skills, not personal characteristics that need to be hidden or minimized. Take pride in your HBCU education, your church community, your family traditions, your natural hair, your code switching abilities, and all the other aspects of your identity that make you who you are. The goal isn't to assimilate into white corporate culture, it's to change that culture to be more inclusive, more authentic, and more representative of the diverse world we live in. I want to speak directly to the young Black women who are just starting their careers. You are entering a professional world that is different from the one I encountered 20 years ago, but discrimination still exists, and you need to be prepared for it. Build your skills, document your achievements, cultivate your network, and never let anyone make you feel like your authentic self is too much for their comfort. To the Black men watching this, your support and allyship are crucial in this fight. When you witness discrimination against Black women in your workplaces, speak up. Use your voices and your platforms to amplify our experiences and advocate for change. The fight for racial justice requires all of us working together. And to everyone in our community, I want to emphasize the importance of economic empowerment. Support Black-owned businesses, invest in Black entrepreneurs, and create economic opportunities within our own communities. The more economic power we build collectively, the less dependent we become on systems that discriminate against us. If you've made it this far in this video, I want you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel and share this story with other people who need to hear it. Second, leave a comment, sharing your own experiences with workplace discrimination or your thoughts on how we can continue fighting for justice. Third, take one concrete action this week to support the fight for workplace equity, whether that's documenting an incident you've experienced, reaching out to support someone who's facing discrimination, or connecting with organizations that are working for change. The fight for justice is not a sprint. It's a marathon that requires endurance, strategy, and community support. But every victory, no matter how small, moves us closer to a world where Black excellence is recognized, celebrated, and rewarded rather than feared and suppressed. My grandmother Evelyn used to say that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. Every time we stand up to discrimination, every time we refuse to accept injustice, every time we force systems to change, we honor the sacrifices of those who came before us and create possibilities for those who will come after us. The work continues, the fight goes on, and together we will keep pushing until equality isn't something we have to fight for. It's something we can simply expect. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of this movement for justice.